About the In Touch ministry and how as a church family we're beginning to impact even further all those in our local area. Great to have Miles with a new haircut too. I didn't recognize Miles when I came in tonight. He's had a haircut, those of you who don't realize. It's normally this big. Miles, great haircut, great haircut. We love it. Ditto. Yes, I had mine last week, that's right. Okay. Down to the Bible passage in John chapter 5, enough of this nonsense. And to the big question tonight, how can Jesus be God? It always fascinates me how these surveys of religious opinion in the UK, time and again, suggest that far from the UK being a secular society, the majority of us readily admit to being religious or spiritual. For instance, one recent survey has revealed that more than half of us believe in an afterlife. 62% believe in some form of almighty higher power, and 69% believe in the existence of a human soul. Now, whenever I read those kinds of results, I wonder how people define soul. And I'd like to know what the 62% thought they meant when they said they believed in an almighty higher power. But the fact remains that however we interpret the results, we do appear to be incurably religious. So over these next few Sunday evenings, we're going to lift the lid on some of the most frequently asked questions about faith and God. I mean, one of the most basic is the question, is there a God? And if you weren't here this morning to hear Michael Ott's recommend his own book, then let me do it for him again tonight. What kind of God? It's a great book, this. There are some copies available this evening, and apparently Michael has reduced the price from £8 to £5 for you, just tonight, and he will be willing to sign the book as well. That will increase its value in the future. Michael Otts is very much involved with us here at Lansdowne as part of the Michael Otts Evangelism Trust Group. So Michael's written a very helpful book on some of the big questions with the title, What Kind of God? Now, according to those surveys, while a lot of us clearly find it difficult to believe in God, even more of us are intrigued by the possibility that God might exist. Do you know these lines from the poem Psychode? As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd stay away. That's the human condition. On the one hand, people want to find God, and on the other, they are anxious to flee from him. We protest violently that we want to be left alone, and yet the very thing we most fear is the dread possibility of being alone. But that question, is there a God, is actually, what's the evidence for God? Because for every glorious autumn day like today, there is somewhere an earthquake or a flood which sweeps thousands to their death. This wonderful, beautiful world is at the same time a tragic place of unimaginable evil and cruelty. If God is there, then at best some would say that the evidence for him is contradictory. At worst, any God who allows suffering to continue on the scale it does in our world seems either powerless to deal with it or morally dubious. But what is it we're after when we ask for evidence for God? Is it mathematical, demonstrable proofs? The reality is that God cannot be proved like the equation 1 + 1 = 2. Nor can God be proved by a kind of scientific experiment. You know, I drop an apple and it falls to the ground, and I go on dropping apples and they go on falling to the ground. I then formulate a theory, as Isaac Newton did, the law of gravity, which I can test by further experiments. But knowing God is not a mathematical or scientific thing. It's more like the knowledge we develop when we get to know another person. In fact, if you try to express human existence and personal knowledge only in scientific terms, it doesn't quite work. And that is what communism has attempted to do, to reduce everything to scientific, non-personal terms. So, rather funnily, a communist textbook describes a kiss as the approach of two pairs of lips with reciprocal transmission of microbes and carbon dioxide. Now, you try saying that to someone you love very much. Let me give you a transmission of microbes and carbon dioxide, and see what they say. That's not the best way of expressing love, is it? Yet, what is love? What is the beauty of a sunset? What is the spirit in a football team? Now, they're real enough. They exist. But they can't be reduced to mathematical data or scientific analysis without making a mockery of them. The only way we can know a person is by trusting that person, committing ourselves to that person, believing and acting upon what they say. I can never prove a person. It's only when I enter into some sort of relationship that I can begin to say that I know that person. And when it comes to the issue of knowing God, that's the sort of knowledge that it best approximates to. When the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin came back from the first manned flight into space and apparently said, "I couldn't see any God up there," he may have thought he was being clever, but he actually mistook scientific knowledge for personal knowledge. Now, let me move the argument forward. Just imagine that during lunch hour tomorrow, you and a friend are talking about the important things in life. And then the conversation turns to God, and your friend says, "I'd believe in God if he were to come and stand right now in front of me. If I could meet him, talk to him, if only I could see him, that would prove his existence. Then I'd be convinced." Now, what are the odds of God turning up in your office canteen tomorrow? But it's the contention of Christianity that God did precisely that. He turned up. He appeared on earth. More than that, he lived on earth. He didn't just pay us a quick visit in some alien spacecraft. He came personally, and people met him and talked to him. You see, as far as Christianity is concerned, the answer to the question, is there a God, and if so, what is God like, is tonight's question. How can Jesus be God? For the central claim of the Christian faith is that in Jesus of Nazareth, God became human. God revealed himself fully and exclusively in the personality, in the words and works of a first century Palestinian Jew. That's the Christian claim, not that Jesus became divine or that others mistakenly attached the label to him. The trouble with you Christians is that you're too rigid, too intolerant. Surely the spiritual insights of all religions are equally valid. Why do you make these exclusive claims for Jesus? But in fact, as we'll see from the paragraphs in John's Gospel that Clive read just now in chapter 5, the trouble is not what Christians claim about Jesus. The trouble is what Jesus said about himself. So, let's look firstly then at the Jesus of the New Testament who made staggering personal claims. This was picked up by the authorities. From the very beginning, the religious authorities understood that this man was making outrageous, no, blasphemous statements, if they weren't true. You see, instantly they grasped the implications. A man who claimed to be God couldn't just be a good man. He had to be something more, and that something more, they felt, was dangerous. You see, verse 18. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill Jesus. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And Jesus has always had this impact upon people. if we seriously examine his life and study his words, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that, for example, the journalist Malcolm Muggeridge came to in the 1960s. He wrote, "I understood that Jesus could not be turned into just a great man. He was God or he was nothing." One of the early 20th century Archbishops of Canterbury, William Temple, said, "The only Jesus for whose existence we have any evidence at all is a gigantic figure making stupendous claims." And yet, here's the thing. Jesus makes these gigantic self-assertions with modesty and humility. Listen to the end of the sequence we read. Jesus says, "By myself, I can do nothing." So in the same breath, Jesus is claiming to be both helpless and omnipotent, almighty. Now, how do we come to terms with someone like that? Of course, people over the ages dismiss these words by arguing that Jesus never said them in the first place. The Jesus of the academic critics argue that it was the church, centuries after Jesus, who put these words into his mouth. Whereas others, perhaps in the last 150 years or so, filmmakers and theater writers, filmmakers like Martin Scorsese in his Last Temptation of Christ, and to a lesser extent, musical theater composers like Andrew Lloyd Webber, they have portrayed Jesus as a sometimes tortured, confused, muddle-headed Messiah, uncertain of his identity and driven by other people's agenda to an accidental death. But I don't find that in the text of John's Gospel. What I find here is a man who has a very clear sense of his identity and his purpose. And it's the Jewish authorities of the first century who are unable to fathom how Jesus could possibly say these things. How could a Jewish man claim divinity without being a rival to God? For the God of the Jews was singular, the one God. Incidentally, that is precisely an issue which trips up Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses. How can Jesus be God? So what follows in John's Gospel is Jesus' explanation of the way in which he is equal with God, but not as another God, but sharing with God the same identity, the same dignity, and the same authority. And far from the church, centuries later, imposing a divine identity upon the human Jesus, the issue of Jesus' status is the central controversy from the start. And it was Jesus who provoked it. Okay, how therefore did Jesus understand and explain himself? Here's some things to take away with you and think about. The Jesus of the New Testament gospel acts as God. Back up a bit to verse 16 of our passage. According to that verse, what provoked this particular storm at this particular time was the healing of a man by Jesus on the Sabbath earlier that day. The miracle is recorded in the first part of chapter 5. And Jesus' defense of his miracle in verse 17 is interesting. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." In other words, what Jesus is saying there is that he could no more stop making people better, healing the man by the pool, the man who'd been paralyzed for 38 years. He could no more stop doing that kind of thing than God could stop spinning the world on its axis. He is making a staggering claim that he, Jesus, reproduces on earth the activity of the Creator God. I can't help it, says Jesus. Just as the Father is working, so too I am working. I'm one with God in his creative power and glory. Listen to how another Jewish mind, no less steeped in the belief that there is only one God, will later describe the impact of Jesus upon him. He wrote this: Christ is the image of the invisible God. All creation comes from him and is held together by him and exists for him. That's a paraphrase of Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, the Jewish scholar. He encountered Jesus for himself and came to those conclusions about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, back to John 5 and verse 19. So in harmony with God is Jesus that he claims that whatever God would do in a given situation, then he will do. Do you see that? Verse 19. I tell you the truth. The Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. So what would God do as he meets a blind man? Well, then that's what Jesus would do. What would God do as a leper approaches him? Then that is what Jesus would do. Jesus knows what the Father will do and does it. In every situation, he deals with it the way that God would. He reflects exactly how God behaves. Jesus answers this age-old question: what is God like? He's like me, says Jesus. Maybe this illustration can help you to get what Jesus is driving at. Imagine you're in one of our finest cathedrals, up the road in Salisbury Cathedral, and you're walking around that ancient building trying to take it all in. And you come across one of those angled mirrors on the floor, designed to help people like you, tourists. And as you look into the mirror, you realize that you are in fact looking at the magnification of the glorious detail of the building above you. You can see much more clearly what would always remain, without that magnification, a distant outline. But the shape now, the color, the patterns are perfectly reproduced right there in front of you. You got that? Jesus is the exact representation of God's being, says the Bible. God in perfect miniature, up close and personal. That's the first thing. Here's the second, from verse 20. The Jesus of the New Testament gospel knows as God. He doesn't just act as God, he knows as God. Listen to verse 20. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, to your amazement, he will show him even greater things than these. The Father shows the Son all that he does. In other words, Jesus is not getting his information about God secondhand. There is such a shared relationship of love and knowledge between the Father and the Son that there is a complete oneness. They are on the same wavelength, as we might say. And because of that, Jesus comments, if you think that the healing of the paralyzed man that I did earlier in the day was impressive, then you just wait. You ain't seen nothing yet. And as we make our way through this gospel, John's gospel, in chapter 6, Jesus feeds the 5,000 and then walks on water. In chapter 9, he heals a blind man. In chapter 11, he raises a dead man. These are all examples of the nature of the relationship that Jesus has uniquely and exclusively with God. He knows as God does. He sees as God does. He acts as God does. And so we are driven to the inescapable conclusion that Jesus is claiming to be more than a prophet with insight into God. He is claiming to know God completely because he is loved by God completely. In Jesus Christ, God is fully known. For Jesus is not merely leading us to God. No, he is revealing God to us. Again, use your imagination. You're in a room which is completely dark, no means of letting light in. And then someone knocks a hole in the wall and makes a window there. And the light streams into the room and it's illuminated. But now you can also see the outside world through that window. A world which was always there, but which you couldn't see properly before. You knew nothing about. The analogy? Jesus is that window into God. He is the light of God who's come into the world to illuminate it and to let us see the God who is there. Thirdly, the Jesus of the New Testament gospel gives life as God. Here again the text, verse 21. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he's pleased to give it. Let me put it like this. What's Jesus saying? He's saying that the power of life and death are in his hands, as they are in the hands of God. If you want it even clearer still, then listen to this in verse 26. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself. The stupendous statement of Jesus there is that, like God, he enjoys uncreated, self-existent life. He has no beginning and no ending. He is eternal. Jesus, therefore, is the eternal power supply for every breath we take every day of our lives, while he himself needs no source for his own life. For he is, with God, the source of every living thing. In Jesus, all things move and have their being. That's his glory. And the very day on which Jesus makes these stupendous claims, he has given new physical life to that paralyzed man by the pool. But he's not only the author of physical life, he's also, like God, the giver of new spiritual life, the life of the age to come. Verse 24, I tell you the truth, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. He has crossed over from death to life. Do you see what that verse is telling us tonight? Because Jesus speaks as God and acts as God, he gives life as God gives life. And when we hear his word of life to us and believe that God has sent him, wow, what does he say? We have new spiritual life now, today. We have crossed over already out of the realm of death into the realm of this new spiritual reality. For the believer in Jesus exists in parallel universes, in two dimensions at the same time. While we live and die physically in this world, we are actually living spiritually in the new world of eternal life. And here's the point: we don't have to wait until we die physically to change environments. That happens, says Jesus, when we hear his word and we believe it. We move from one reality to the other. And that happens, my friends, when we trust in Christ for ourselves. For Jesus is the corridor leading us through this world into the next. That's the power of Jesus. The word of life in those who hear him and believe. The power of Jesus that very day brought life to the dead limbs of the man at the pool is the identical power which will one day call the dead of every generation into life from the power of death to face judgment. And so, here's our next. The Jesus of the New Testament gospel judges as God. He acts as God. He knows as God. He judges as God. We're staggered again by the sheer scale of his claim in verse 22. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. And then verse 27. He, the Father, has given the Son authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. You see, here it is. Jesus is claiming the right, the executive authority and power to offer us forgiveness for our sins and peace with God in time, and at the end of time to declare people innocent or guilty before the bar of God's justice. In time, he alone can forgive us our sin and give us peace with God. At the end of time, he alone can pronounce verdict, innocent or guilty. And he has every right to that role among us because he's the Son of Man. Notice the phrase, the Son of Man. In other words, he's one of us. But of course, he's also different from us because he's God. So on both counts, he is in the best position to judge. For we are already in relationship to him. We've been created by him. And our existence is sustained by him, and therefore our future will be determined by him. And it's this full and complete humanity of Jesus which reassures us that we are not at the end of time going to be judged by someone who cannot possibly relate to us and who knows nothing of what it's like to live here on earth. He did. He knows your pain. He knows the inside out of the human condition. But the reassurance of that sympathetic judge on the last day is matched by the equally important reality that Jesus will judge as the man from heaven, the man who is fully God. Therefore, Jesus will assess us with absolute justice and fairness. He's not going to go and listen to a focus group and then decide what to do. Public opinion will not be the shifting standard of his judgment. Rather, it will be his infinitely holy character. He will judge perfectly, and there will be no one asking for a retrial. There will be no miscarriages of justice. There will be no argument about the verdict pronounced over your life and mine. Why does Jesus assume this right to judge? Because finally, the Jesus of the New Testament gospel is worshipped as God. The phrase in verse 23, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. That all may acknowledge the Son, worship the Son, recognize the Son as they, in the same way, honor, recognize God the Father. Honor is due to Jesus in the way it's due to God. Jesus insists that we bow before him as we bow before God. He asks that people recognize and acknowledge his deity, his place of supremacy, his right to be crowned. There's a moment at the end of this gospel, John's gospel, when one of Jesus' friends, Thomas, who'd been a little skeptical about Jesus and who had massive doubts that the reports of Jesus' resurrection were true, was now with the disciples. And there's Thomas with his friends, and Jesus turns up and says, "Come on, Thomas, look at my hands. See the nail prints. Look at my side. See the spear mark. Thomas, do you believe now?" And Thomas falls at Jesus' feet in worship, one Jew before another, and says, "My Lord and my God." A remarkable claim. And Jesus didn't say, "Thomas, you're embarrassing me. You've got it wrong." He accepts Thomas' response of worship. So, my friends, I'm really glad you're here tonight. And I want to tell you that the whole purpose of Jesus coming into the world is to help us understand that God really does exist, that God is not a figment of our imagination, that those 62% in that UK survey with which I began, who say that they believe in the Almighty, they're not suffering from some grand delusion. Jesus comes to tell us that God is, and he comes to show us what God is like. Do you remember how towards the end of the film The Wizard of Oz, the yellow brick road runs out? Dorothy and Scarecrow and Tin Man and Lion, well, they finally get to meet the wizard in the hope that they'll get what they want. A brain, a heart, some courage, and in Dorothy's case, of course, to go home to Kansas. And Toto the dog wanders behind the curtain and pulls it open and reveals the truth behind the great and terrible Wizard of Oz. He's a hoax, a fake. He's just a kindly but rather weak old man without any special powers. What Dorothy the Scarecrow, the Lion, and the Tin Man had hoped and believed turned out not to be real. Many people live with a sneaking fear that maybe, like the Wizard of Oz, God is a hoax and religious faith is a bit of a con. Maybe he's not real. It's all wishful thinking somewhere over the rainbow. The New Testament gospel says that Jesus is the evidence that God is real. The realness of Jesus guarantees the realness of God. By sending Jesus to live among us and then to die for us on the cross, to shed his blood for us, God makes himself tangible, concrete. By dying for us, Jesus makes the love of God unmistakable. By rising again for us, Jesus makes the power of God invincible. So how can Jesus be God? Because he acts as God. He speaks as God. He knows as God. He gives life as God. He judges as God. And he is worshipped as God. To know him is to know God. C.S. Lewis was perhaps the person who in the 20th century argued most effectively to a skeptical world for the uniqueness of Jesus. He summed up the choice everyone has to make when confronted by Jesus' staggering claims. In the mouth of any other speaker, says Lewis, in the mouth of any other speaker who is not God, these words would imply what I can only regard as a silliness and conceit unrivaled by any character in history. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he is a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. My friends, the choice is yours. Jesus Christ reveals God to us. Do you believe that? Because if you do, there can only be one response. That is to submit and surrender our lives in all their totality to Jesus, the one who acts as God and speaks as God and knows as God and judges as God and who is to be worshipped as God. Jesus Christ is Lord.